okay with the proposed written instructions? Yes?
Yes, sir. Yes, yes, sir.
Ready for your argument?
Yes, sir.
Bring the jury in. Thank you, Madam Clerk. We're back in session. The court recognizes Mr. Miles for the defendants.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. Mr. Waller, members of law enforcement, and members of the audience. Good afternoon. It's been a long road to get here, and there are no happy endings, no matter what you decide today. And we heard Mr. Waller's forceful and aggressive argument with regards to the interpretation of the law in North Carolina, and I'm going to address some of the assertions that he made. And maybe it is at this point that you believe that there's overwhelming evidence that the Matthews are guilty of crimes and that your plan is to convict them. And I understand this is an emotional case. This is an emotional case. But we, from the defendant's side of the room, have tried to proceed in a respectful and courteous way, ask proper questions, respectful questions, and treat the witnesses as all of us would like to be treated. That doesn't mean we agree with everything that they say or aren't skeptical of some of the things that were brought out during this trial, but you are the finders of fact, and you have to decide who is credible and who is not, and maybe who's somewhere in between. So I made some predictions about the evidence at the beginning of the trial. I expect that most of them came true, but obviously you've got to rely on your notes and your own recollections of the evidence. But if you go back and think about the things that I said as to what the evidence will show, I believe for the most part that they were accurate. And so what do we have here? Big picture wise, obviously no matter what happens today, the lawsuit is still out there. Trooper Greg Taylor and his wife will continue to suffer the loss of their son. But one thing as we sort of start the analysis I'd like to do is tweak the facts a little bit, just for purposes of analysis, and to think about what would have happened had, when JT left the home of Chip and Kim Matthews, had he been waiting outside and Trooper Taylor picked him up. Would it have changed the facts that you're supposed to analyze today at all as far as the guilt or innocence of Kim and Chip Matthews? Obviously, there was a lot of evidence about the wreck, the death of JT Taylor, which obviously is nothing but tragic. But isn't it interesting that the state began with that evidence through the Taylors and ended with that evidence through Officer Manukas? Obviously, there were a couple witnesses after that, but those were their bookends. And really, that part of the case obviously is not in dispute as to what happened to JT. But it's a very emotional part of the case that you've got to get through as far as being objective. And that's what I talked about at the beginning, emotion in the clear lens. Now, the day, June 28, 2014, was supposed to be about Nicole Kanopoulos and Jason Kazor, as you recall. And here's a picture that was entered into evidence of the Matthews, and you see JT in the background when the ceremony began, which was somewhere between 7:30 and 7:45. And you heard about the schedule that was put in place, and you heard about the decision to have alcohol there. Now, alcohol obviously is a big part of this case because that's part of the allegations against the Matthews, that they served underage. They aided and abetted, encouraged the group of young adults, and I'll call them adults because I think that's what the evidence reflects. That's what they're charged with. And so as far as alcohol goes, it's a personal choice. Obviously, people have strong feelings one way or the other, but it's legal in North Carolina. It's legal to have it in your home. It's legal to serve it to your guests. And that's one of the backdrops of this case. Whether your personal opinion is it's evil or not, that's a personal choice. But for purposes of our analysis, it's legal to serve it. So was that done responsibly here? Have the things that you've seen presented by the state, it's their burden of proof, have you seen that it was done irresponsibly? Was hiring Cafe Parazide, which was a trusted catering company with a personal connection to Ms. Matthews, was that an irresponsible thing to do, to hire a catering company that was going to provide not one, but two bartenders, to man not two bars, one bar, two bartenders at a time, and to pay them money to serve the alcohol and be responsible for the alcohol? Was that the wrong thing to do? Obviously, as I stated in the opening, there wasn't any evidence that the Matthews gave them instructions to serve Thomas and his friends. And I'll talk about this later a little bit too. Mr. Weaver testifies he's shocked that there's intoxicated young people at the wedding, but doesn't say anything. He's got the bartenders there that are responsible for the alcohol, doesn't say anything to the host at all if he has concerns, and then is adamant that his bartenders follow the law. Is that reasonable when you analyze his testimony? Was it reasonable for him to think that none of the alcohol came from his bartenders? He testified he saw glasses on the table, if you recall that, and they were empty. What is the standard for bartenders? When you're paid to do a certain job, what is their responsibility here? And again, was it reckless for the Matthews to depend on them and rely on them? 18 years old in North Carolina. You've heard a lot of labeling in this case. Kids, children, teenagers. Remember at the beginning I told you I was going to call them what they were, 18 years old and 17 years old. We may have differing opinions on how we should label them, but at 18 years old in North Carolina, you can enter into contract, you can file lawsuits and be subject to a lawsuit, you can own a firearm, you can vote, you can serve in the military, you can be prosecuted in adult court, you can serve as a juror. Now, maybe this is part of the beginning of a process in our society where we want to reevaluate that. Maybe the time has come where we need to adjust the age of adulthood and make it so that maybe it should be 21 for all these obligations and rights that we put on individuals. But for purposes of our consideration here, that's what we're dealing with as far as 18-year-olds. And of course, Natalie Freeman's 17, but she's right there. She's not a child. She made choices, just as all the group made choices. Is this that case? And of course, I don't know what your expectations were when you sat down to hear the evidence and heard that it was aid and abet underage drinking. But when I say that case, the case where the parents are partying with the young people. The case where they're buying them beer and giving it to them and saying, hey, let's dance and listen to music and let's party. Let's get hammered. Let's be selfish and just have a good time. And we can do it together, and it's okay. I'll get the beer for you. I'll get the wine. I'll get the liquor. Is that what we have here? Is the state trying to push the envelope a little bit here? I mean, that's a different case than we have here, I would submit the evidence shows. The evidence. You judge the credibility of the witnesses, and I'll go through some of the witness testimony in a little bit. But you need to remember, and the judge will tell you, the burden of proof never shifts to the defendant. The defendants have a presumption of innocence. You must be entirely convinced or fully satisfied of guilt as to each charge. That's reasonable doubt. That's the definition of reasonable doubt. And of course, the expectation is the state is going to come with every piece of admissible evidence they have to try to convict Kim and Chip. I mean, you heard Jason Waller. He feels very strongly about his evidence. There were a lot of law enforcement officers used, at least we heard from at least four of them, in the investigation and prosecution of this case. Don't you expect, if there was smoke and gun evidence that Kim and Chip were intentionally, knowingly providing alcohol to Thomas and his friends, you'd have it in front of you? If that smoke and gun picture, and Mr. Waller made reference to it, I don't have a picture of them dancing and having their arms around each other, but don't you think if there was something like that, you would have seen it? Isn't it significant that you didn't see one picture with Thomas and his parents out of 2,600 that the photographer took? Not one picture of Thomas and his parents? Are facts. There was a timeline, and you heard the state talk, the officers talk about trying to create a timeline. We have a wedding and reception from 7:30 to 10:30-ish. I think the evidence showed that the wedding and the reception lasted a little longer than that. But one of the significant parts of evaluating the evidence is the time frame in which you heard evidence that Thomas and his friends were drinking at the front and at the back. Mr. Waller showed you a picture of Chip Matthews in the front of the house. That's after the pictures were taken, if you heard testimony of most of the witnesses. After the family pictures were taken. Thomas is in that picture too. I would argue to you that is shortly before everybody comes to the front. And that's the only picture you saw of Kim or Chip in the front at all. And a lot of the witness testimony was that's where they saw the drinking of the group, the young adults. And one of the witnesses, and I have to point it out while I'm thinking about it, Ms. Beinecke, the former teacher, my recollection, and you trust your own recollection, was that she testified that she saw them at the front of the house with wine glasses on the table. Then later, when she was in the back patio, she didn't recall seeing them with glasses on the table or drinking. And in fact, I believe there was a picture, and I'll try to find it for you later. I've got some of the state's exhibits here, where she is in close proximity to the group, and they're at their high top table. She's even got her head facing that way, and she says, I don't recall seeing them with alcohol or drinking back there. That's my recollection of the evidence. You trust your own. You didn't hear any evidence of heavy drinking, if any drinking, by Chip and Kim. You did hear evidence of other adults who were concerned about the group of young people but didn't say anything to Chip and Kim. The Ravenscroft teachers, the Cafe Pears odd folks. Does that mean they need to be prosecuted? I don't think so. But it's troubling that if their recollection was that they saw intoxicated young people, that they didn't feel compelled to do something about it. Or maybe it was that at the time they saw them, They thought it was going to be okay. And maybe they weren't that drunk. I don't know. But that was a choice that they made individually that affected ultimately what happened in this case. Concern for Thomas's friends. A large part of Mr. Waller's argument is that the Matthews were cold or indifferent or not taking action, to allowing things to happen, not taking action. I would argue to you the evidence doesn't indicate that. I think the evidence indicates that once Kim Matthews became aware of intoxication, that she did take action. She saw JT having problems. She goes, helps him inside, talks to him there, and then goes off. And I believe that the timeline would show when she left, it was when she was dealing with Natalie and or Anna and getting Natalie's father to come and providing Natalie with a towel and again helping her call her father. I mean, is she indifferent? Is she reckless in doing that? I don't think so. A pretty interesting omission. We didn't hear anything from the parents of Anna and Natalie who came and picked up their children that night. Nothing from them about their feelings about how the Matthews handled the situation or whether they were happy or relieved to get a call or relieved to get that Dr. Matthews made a 911 call because he was concerned about Anna Urgish. But that would have been interesting to hear. And of course, going back to the time frame, the Matthews were in the back patio and I would argue too, sometime between 8 and 8:30 and 10 o'clock is our time frame. So the state is really looking at from the time the cocktail hour was over in the front, the reception starts in the back with food and the dancing by the family, to around 10 o'clock, which is the estimate of the time where Ms. Matthews interacted with JT. That's the period of time that we're evaluating as far as whether, what's happening during that time and what the Matthews are seeing or not seeing. And let me be frank, I mean, is it reasonable to think at some point that they didn't see a glass on a table? I don't think that's reasonable to think. I think it's reasonable to think they did at some point. But as far as what they were doing in visiting with their guests and being with their daughter and watching their daughter dance with her husband and be with her husband, dance with their daughter for the family, the families doing the dances with the bride and the groom, the fathers, the mothers. Is it reasonable to think that their focus should have been on Thomas and his friends? In retrospect, if you're trying to be a Monday morning quarterback, gosh, it should have been so obvious to them. But in that moment of that wedding, was it indifference to be focused on your daughter and the biggest day of her life or one of the biggest days of her life? I would submit to you no. So let's talk about the evidence a little bit. Ms. Taylor, heart-wrenching testimony. She showed you the text messages between she and JT. It was 10:16 or 10:17, I believe, when he sent the text message to be picked up. And then, of course, the horrific chain of events that followed with Trooper Taylor trying to find him and nobody knowing where he went. She relayed to you her phone call with Kim Matthews that was, I believe the evidence showed 1:06 a.m. And she told you that Kim told her that JT stumbled to her car. That's my recollection. Stumbled to his car, excuse me. And I had to point out on cross-examination, and Sergeant Hoolan reinforced this, that Mrs. Taylor had told Sergeant Hoolan that Kim's statement was a little bit different than what Ms. Taylor told you on the stand. That is, that Ms. Kim Matthews said that someone had told her he left with a bald guy, and Kim thought that was Trooper Taylor. Obviously, an awful call that Ms. Matthews made to Ms. Taylor, and obviously that affected Ms. Matthews when shortly after she's interacting with the police, and she and her husband, who's in the background saying, "Oh my God," come down to deal with Officer Wall, and then decide to go down after Officer Wall leaves and check on Anna to make sure she's okay, and then decide to call 911. Isn't that the timeline? So Trooper Taylor testified that JT knew his stance on alcohol. He tries desperately to locate JT at Vance Street and in the surrounding area. He just makes the decision not to go in, and obviously he's trained law enforcement. He was doing what he felt like he needed to do to try to find his son, and he was unable to do it. And he sat up here on the witness stand and was emotional and told us that he wants the Matthews to be held criminally accountable. And so I submit to you, what kind of pressure does that create? What kind of pressure on the Raleigh Police Department does that create, on the ALE, on the District Attorney's Office? I would submit to you that it does create pressure. Significant pressure. Anna Ergish. She was an interesting witness. Anna, it was significant to me how unabashedly she talked about drinking, and how it didn't appear that her conscience was bothering her about what they did on that day with going to the ABC store, with bringing the Fireball. And do we believe, and she said they didn't drink the Fireball. Do we believe that? Do we believe that she didn't drink the Fireball? She said she didn't. She brought it, and she definitely made it clear that she wanted to get drunk. But she did testify, and in an important point, that she was trying to discreetly drink. She wasn't trying to put it in the face of the Matthews. She's trying to steer clear of the Matthews. She made it clear that the bartenders didn't ask for identification. She made it clear that sometimes she got handed glasses directly from the bartenders. And of course, she told that to the police. But Sergeant Houlihan sat up there and said, we didn't have any evidence that the bartenders did anything wrong. She testified she didn't see the Matthews in the front. We've got, I say no walking around with a glass in her hand. There is one picture that Mr. Waller showed you. She is in the patio somewhere with a glass in her hand. So I'd ask you to disregard that. But I would say there's just that one picture of her with a glass in her hand. She's got a phone. She sees Thomas. She indicates that no one was planning on driving, that everybody's plan was to spend the night at the Matthews, even though none of them talked to the Matthews about it. She didn't talk to, strike that. She said that Alex Matthews may have helped her downstairs, that her charge got dismissed, and that and then of course she's in several pictures in Nicole and Jason's first dance. And that's what the state relies on as part of the knowledge of my defendant, of my clients, Kim and Chip. That's a lot of what they rely on, those first dance photos. And again, I would argue to you, the focus of the Matthews certainly was on their daughter at that time. Natalie Freeman, invited by Thomas. She doesn't know Kim or Chip, but she meets Kim early on. But I think the evidence was clear through her testimony that she had never met Chip Matthews. And of course, it's a fair inference that he didn't know who she was. And you recall that picture, and the picture that the state points to of Chip Matthews being across from the high top table, where at that time it's Josh, Natalie, Anna, where JT and Thomas? Did they see Dr. Matthews coming? I would suggest to you you could argue that. They got out of Dodge. And so they have Chip Matthews there. Josh isn't drinking. Natalie, maybe, maybe not at that point. Remember, she said she gets sick at the back. And then, does Anna have a glass or not? And Chip's talking to his daughter. And they're right there. And is it fair to say that he might have seen it? Sure. At that point, was she acting impaired? Was she actively drinking and chugging champagne or wine? Did she have a fake ID and had the bartender carded her? Natalie Freeman said, again, she's planning to spend the night, and she said that JT and Thomas drank more of the Jack Daniels, and that's one of the things that you have to consider, because Mr. Waller talks a lot about how drunk everybody was. Were they drunk because of the Jack Daniels? Were they drunk because of whatever they consumed at the Matthews home? Is that relevant, or does it matter? It matters in that they drank a significant amount before they came there. And obviously it took a while to kick in. By 10 o'clock, they all were showing signs of intoxication. But to say they had so much wine or that there were multiple glasses being drunk, I believe that's a little bit of a jump. We've got Anna saying that she drank the whole time, but look at the pictures. Well, I'll show you some of the pictures. I mean, the picture, most of the pictures that you see that the state showed you were of that first dance. And if you recall, for the second dance, or what I would submit to you arguably appears to be the next order of business, if I can find the photo here. Can't find it. There's a photo the state showed you of Nicole dancing with her father. And that's around the time Chip was across from that high top table where Josh and Natalie and Anna were. And JT and Thomas are gone. And where'd they go? And you heard evidence that the people went different places. But think about the pictures that they showed you in the time frame. That high top table, all the pictures are taken, I would submit to you, with the glasses on the table. It's the first dance, and it's the dance with Nicole and her dad. How long do you think that took? 10 minutes? Was it a 10-minute time frame there? The pictures were time stamped. State entered those time stamps into evidence. Natalie Freeman, going back to her, she and JT, while everybody was at the front, go to her car to take the jam and saw Ravenscroft teacher, and you heard from her. They didn't have any drinks in their hand, and obviously the teacher, Ms. Riggenbach, didn't say anything to them at that point. They didn't seem impaired at that point. Natalie Freeman indicates she went to the basement after the first or second dance. And I believe that was State's Exhibit 30 I was talking about there with the picture of Nicole and her father. She didn't want to embarrass herself, didn't want to see anyone, I believe she testified. Kim was helping her and her father was called. She thinks Alex and Thomas helped her as well. And this was an interesting part of her testimony. She kept the Jack Daniels bottle and gave it to the Taylor's lawyer's paralegal. Was that a piece of evidence in this case? Should that have been turned over to the Raleigh police? She said that she and Thomas went to the Taylor residence, and there were lawyers there, and they questioned Thomas, and Thomas was shaken up. Goes back to the pressure that's in this case. Significant pressure. Josh McCoy, you want to say Josh was the responsible one. Josh doesn't admit drinking anything. The evidence was from the other witnesses that he may have had a sip of wine, may have had a sip of Jack Daniels. But he knew he had to drive, so he didn't want to drink. He said he indicated he wanted to go to church the next day. He knew Nicole, but even though he knew Nicole, he didn't have any interaction with the Matthews. And he's with the group most of the time, so we know through him, Kim and Chip aren't coming up to them. They're just not. They're focused on other people, other guests, other family. He leaves somewhere between 9:30 and 10:30. Lindsay Riggenbach, we've already talked about her. Her husband was closer with the group than she was. She didn't remember seeing them on the back patio, and I think I've got her picture. Hopefully I can find it. Yes. Remember? And this is a picture where you see Thomas and appears to be Anna. And I would submit to you, if you check the timestamps, this is after the cake has been cut. And they're not, you don't see any alcohol in their hands, and they're in very close proximity to Ms. Riggenbach. Oh, goodness. She indicated that she didn't say anything to Kim and Chip about what she'd seen in the front. Lucia Foster. What do we think about her? Word to Cafe Parazide indicated she'd been trained as a bartender in Maryland. Denies serving any of them. She's the backup bartender. She sees the group with, or she denies seeing the group with alcohol. Says it gives JT water. Told them they weren't old enough. She indicated that JT talked to Chip and they both had water. The group, she indicated they were going to the basement some. She indicated that JT and Thomas went to the driveway at some point. She didn't see Chip or Kim drinking alcohol. Is it credible? Is her testimony credible to you as far as how the alcohol might have gotten in their hands? Do we believe that they grabbed it maybe sneakily, or did they get it from the bartenders? Did they grab glasses that had been left by other guests? They didn't say that. They say they got it from the bar. And that table, if you recall, the high top table at the back patio was really close to the bar, which was right up against the house next to the kitchen with two bartenders there. Josh Weaver, I talked to him about him a little bit before. He seems a little too confident in his version of events with regards to his bartenders wouldn't have served the alcohol. He himself says he poured the champagne out for people, that about half the people got champagne, that he didn't see any of the young people take the champagne. Again, he's shocked that there's young people that are intoxicated, but doesn't say anything to Kim or Chip. Doesn't see Anna, Thomas, JT, or Natalie go to the bar. He does admit to seeing empty glasses on the table. He says the group's going to the basement quite a bit. Said he recalled something about Kim Matthews asking where JT went, and he thought she was talking about someone else. Sharon Beinecke, she had a real history with the young people. She had taught JT, Thomas, and Anna. And then she had a connection to the Matthews, that she's friends with Nicole. Jason Waller indicated that a lot of these folks were friends of the Matthews, but that really wasn't reflected in Sharon's testimony. Ms. Beinecke said that her connection was through her daughter, that she really didn't consider the Matthews friends, they were acquaintances. She says this is awkward. And she said, you remember the statements about, you're not our parents, we're not in school anymore. She said she took them playfully, but weren't they sort of disrespectful? I mean, this was a teacher of theirs. They were doing something they shouldn't have been doing with regards to trying to get wine. But she did not feel compelled to say, she said it was an uncomfortable situation. She didn't feel compelled to say anything to Chip and Kim, and of course they weren't out there at the time. And then of course I indicated that there was a picture, hopefully I have it, where she is on the back patio, and hopefully I can find it quickly. Sorry. Here it is. pulled the wrong one. But I'll talk to you about a couple of pictures I did pull for her. But Ms. Beinecke is there. As you recall, she was testifying that the cake was being cut, and you see JT there. What's JT doing right there? The cake's being cut, which the photographer estimates about 9:45. We see different people holding different drinks. We see Chip holding a drink, and I would argue if you look closely, it looks like water. You have to trust your own judgment on that. But obviously there hadn't been any evidence that he was drinking alcohol. The bartenders didn't testify to that at all, obviously, and nobody else did. But Ms. Beinecke was talking about how special that moment was, and that she remembers being on the back patio, and she didn't see the young people drinking. And here she is. And this is after the cake cutting, I would submit. Here's Nicole. Thad Lawrence, the photographer. He's the one who indicated that the pictures were time-stamped. He was there for the entire event, never interacted with Kim and Chip, indicated that 9:45 was a cake cutting. Thomas and one of the girls were away from the group, away from that high-top table, away from the basement, upstairs. He did confirm that they were intoxicated, but is that what you're here to determine? Are Kim and Chip criminally responsible because they were intoxicated 18-year-olds at their house? Is that what the state's suggesting to you? And they didn't do anything about it? Is that what they're suggesting to you? Is that what the law, I suggest to you that the law you're going to hear is that they had to knowingly aid and abet, knowingly encourage. And you listen to Judge Smith about that. Brian Johnson, the last person to see JT, it seems. JT tells him that he's drunk and stoned, and he's sitting in the library, as Kim Matthews had told the police that is where she left him. You aren't driving, are you? JT says he's not going to drive. May have had his phone in his lap, and it's approximately 10 p.m. We know when he texted his parents, and Brian testified his speech was okay. JT said he was going to check on his friends. And I would suggest to you that, given the fact we don't have any other evidence of what happened to JT, is that likely walking through the kitchen on his way to maybe go to the basement to check on Natalie or Anna, there was a door to the outside on the side of the kitchen, and I suggested to you maybe at some point for some unknown reason he walked outside. Maybe it was to text his parents, maybe he was ready to come home, but he went outside and for whatever reason went to his car. And unfortunately for the Taylors, RPD wasn't able to figure out why. And you remember, Ms. Taylor's like, he wouldn't leave, he wouldn't leave, he wouldn't leave. And maybe some of this is what that is about. Maybe there was hope that one of these witnesses would remember something, and maybe we would figure out what happened to JT and why he got behind the wheel. Sergeant Eric Sweden wasn't up there very long. He said he spoke to the Taylors on the scene, crash scene, and there was some concern about alcohol at that time. Officer Chris Wall was an interesting witness. 2 years of experience on June 28, 2014. Said he had limited information when he went, but he was looking for a party. And obviously he didn't find a party when he got to 904 Vance Street. He testified that he was looking for underage drinkers and impaired drivers, and that didn't seem to jive with what he had said about not knowing much about why he was going over there. He said the Matthews home was dark. Of course, he didn't know at the time. Kim was on the phone with Carrie Taylor learning that JT was dead. Anna is passed out. We heard the EMS call, we heard the 911 call, and the EMS worker testify that she's in bed, not very responsive, having labored breathing. She couldn't have been in the kitchen. Whatever he saw in the kitchen wasn't Anna Ergish. And of course, Kim explained to Sergeant Houlihan that her interpretation of the question he was asking her was, who could have been in the kitchen? And her response, as she told Sergeant Houlihan, was, well, it had to have been Thomas, me, or Chip. And it couldn't have been any of us. He denies knowing anything about a death, which was untrue. He said he was there for a noise complaint, which was untrue. And I would argue that you can infer from the evidence that after the phone call between Carrie Taylor and Kim Matthews, that Chip was in the background saying, "Oh my God, oh my God." They obviously talked about the awful news that they had just had, and that's what Officer Wall was experiencing when they came downstairs to deal with him. So, with regards to the testimony about Chip saying he called JT's dad, of course he didn't call JT's dad. I believe that was, well, I'll say I believe the evidence shows that's likely a misunderstanding of whatever was Officer Wall heard. That likely what the Matthews knew at that time and what Kim had told her husband and what caused him to say, "Oh my God," was that he had gotten in a car wreck and died and had been intoxicated. By that time, Kim and Chip obviously have information that Thomas and his friends have had a lot to drink. Kim's already dealt with Natalie. She's already dealt with Anna. She's already dealt with JT on a limited basis. By that time, it's 1 o'clock in the morning. Of course, the issue has come to light by then. So the Matthews, after the officer leaves, decide to go check on Anna. Dr. Matthews is a doctor, has concerns about her, calls 911, and you heard the 911 tape. Did it seem like he was creating an uncomfortable atmosphere? Did he seem concerned about her? Was he trying to help her? Certainly he was. Kim was on the phone too. Officer Wall says that they were nonchalant. Did that sound nonchalant to you? He didn't put that in his report. Kenneth Walters was that EMS worker who came, and I don't know whether he realized that they made the 911 call or not, and I'm sure he didn't listen to the 911 call. He got dispatched there. But he indicated they had no sense of urgency and they were annoyed, the Matthews. But of course, they had just gotten the news about JT. I don't know about his perception at that time, but the fact that he says that there was no sense of urgency and they were annoyed doesn't quite fit with the situation that he came to at that particular moment. Officer Manukas testified he downloaded all the photos, downloaded all the information from JT's phone, which we never heard anything about during the course of the trial. Admitted that they didn't realize the photos were time-stamped until, I guess it was yesterday, when I pointed it out through the photographer. And then he did his crash reconstruction. Obviously, he's got excellent training. He's an excellent officer with regards to crash reconstruction, and estimates the speed of JT's vehicle at 89 miles an hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone. Talks about the importance of creating a timeline. And then finally, Sergeant Hoolan starts his investigation June 30th, 2014, interviews the Taylors first, determines Carrie Taylor spoke to Kim Matthews before ever Officer Wall interacts with Kim and Chip. Kim cooperates with the investigation and is interviewed without a lawyer. And what does that say about consciousness of guilt or her desire to hide something? And I think it was clear through Sergeant Hoolan's testimony that he didn't ask her a lot of questions. He didn't get into a lot, but he was mainly focused on JT, and she told him what she remembered about JT. She saw him with his head down, brings him inside, puts him in the library, and thought he ended up getting picked up by his father. And that was a wrong assumption. But does that make her a criminal, that was a wrong assumption? Was there any evidence that you heard that Chip or Kim knew that any of those young people had driven to their house for that wedding? I don't believe there was. For whatever reason, there's no request to interview Chip, Nicole, or Alex. He indicated, Sergeant Hoolan, that there wasn't any evidence against the bartenders. And he conceded that he told Anna and Natalie that he was not concerned about their underage drinking. He was trying to find out what happened to JT. And he indicated he didn't really look at the pictures and that there wasn't a screen for controlled substances with regards to toxicology test on JT. The wedding photographs weren't pursued till August 5th, 2014. There was a lot of photographs, somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000. Again, they were time stamped. Did the state talk to you much about a timeline as far as trying to create windows of time where they expected the Matthews to have aided and abetted, encouraged the young people? And again, I'd mentioned this before, numerous pictures of the first dance. Obviously, we don't expect Chip and Kim were focused on Thomas and his friends. And again, there are no pictures. You didn't see one picture of Thomas and either one of his parents. You saw Chip in the way background in that one. And I would submit to you that was shortly before the group went to the front patio for dinner. And of course, the picture of Thomas with the champagne glass that you saw, State put up there. Thomas, you don't see any picture of Kim and Chip in the general vicinity of them either. There's 2,000 to 4,000 pictures. If there was one, you would have seen it. I've talked about the 911 call. Certainly, their decision to go check on Anna and call 911, obviously that was affected by the news of JT's death. They want to make sure she was okay. What about any other evidence that might have been out there? We didn't hear from the ABC employee who sold the Jack Daniels. Alex Matthews wasn't interviewed. Chip Matthews, there was no request for an interview. Obviously, we didn't hear from Thomas Matthews. The toxicologist, there was a stipulation about the results of the toxicology screen. You can look at that if you want, but we know what it was, 0.20. Obviously, JT was impaired. The parents of Anna Ergus and Natalie Freeman, I mentioned that earlier. Wouldn't you like to hear from them as to their perception of what the Matthews did or didn't do for their children on that particular evening? Casey Miller, who's the head bartender, is somewhere else. We didn't hear from her, but she was in charge. She was in charge of the bars, both in the front and the back. Sergeant Hullen told you that he indicated to the bartenders that it was their responsibility to check IDs when he interviewed them. The phones of JT, Anna, Thomas, and Natalie, apparently there wasn't anything on any of those phones, pictures or otherwise, that reflected that Kim and Chip may be guilty of committing crimes. So what is their smoking gun? What is their smoking gun? I guess maybe the pictures of JT with a glass of champagne, Thomas with a glass of champagne, Anna on a couple of occasions? Or is it the picture of Chip when he's sitting across from the table of young people where JT and Thomas aren't? Those are snapshots. They're seconds in time. How many did you see? 30 or 40 from that wedding? What percentage of the photos was that? 2,000 to 4,000 photos tell a story. Did you hear the whole story, or was it cherry-picked to try to create a narrative that just doesn't hold water? That is, that these parents were reckless and indifferent. Kim and Chip Matthews, the mother and stepfather of the bride, they hired a trusted catering company. They don't ever go out on the front porch for any significant period of time during the occasion. No evidence they were drinking. Thomas and JT are gone from the table by the time the bride is dancing with her father. Kim helped Natalie. Alex and Thomas helped Anna. Kim takes JT inside and puts him in the library. He had told her he was spending the night. JT texts his mother, and his father comes to pick him up, and that's what Kim thought happened. Chip calls 911. They cooperated with the investigation. Is the state suggesting to you that North Carolina needs to create a new duty to protect? Criminal accountability for failing to save someone from their own adult choices? Is this where society is now? Is this the message we want to send to our young adults? Is the state of North Carolina asking you to hold the Matthews to a different standard? This isn't a civil case. This is a criminal case. Natalie and Anna received no criminal legal consequences. The bartenders received no criminal legal consequences. We all love our children. We want to protect our children. Obviously, it's the best, hardest job you can ever have. I know all of you don't have children, but if you do, you will know that is true. And I don't have to go into any details about what makes that true. You just know it once you become a parent. But we can't make our decisions for them, their decisions for them. Unfortunately, we train them the best we can to know right from wrong, to do the things that we believe are right, to instill our values into them. And when they become adults, we have to nudge them out the door, and they have to experience life on their own terms. And sometimes those terms are tragic and cruel, don't make sense, and aren't fair. Just a little about the law. Again, Mr. Waller said lots of things about allowing. I think the judge will tell you, knowingly encourage and or aid consumption, possession. I missed a word there, but knowingly encourage and or aid consumption of possession of alcohol. Is there any evidence that Kim and Chip encouraged the group? I would argue to you no. Is there evidence they may have seen them? They possibly saw them at some point. When Kim notices, she takes action. There's evidence that Chip interacted once with JT when they were drinking water. If JT, according to the bartender, wasn't showing extreme signs of intoxication, even if he noticed some signs, what would you have him do? Had he called the Taylors at that point, after that brief interaction, would that make a difference in your analysis of the case? Again, the pictures of Thomas with his parents, and again, the pictures tell the story. You'll hear some other jury instructions from Judge Smith about credibility of witnesses, testimony of interested witnesses. Listen to those. Use them when you analyze the case. They're significant in determining what your verdict should be. And of course, in closing, you represent the community of Wake County. You started as strangers. You've gotten to know each other somewhat over the last few days. And you come together with a common purpose and duty to reach a verdict. When I came before you at the beginning of this, I said this investigation was an emotional response to a tragedy. Was that the evidence that you heard? I would submit to you that it was. The plan of Thomas and his friends, was it selfish, inconsiderate, and reckless? Yes, it was. No happy endings like I started. This part of the story will be over. The next chapter starts for the Taylors and the Matthews. We pray that our children, all children, learn from this tragedy. And ultimately, what you're here to determine, are Kim and Chip criminals? Are the Matthews criminally accountable for what happened? And I suggest to you, they are not criminals, and they should not be held criminally accountable. I appreciate your time, your attention, and thank you for your service today.